Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAMH for short.
It's the last bit, I hope doesn't frighten you, because I did indeed work on behavioural software with a chap called Professor Jim Petraska from Rhode Island University in the States. It's very interesting trying to sort of encourage people to behave in certain ways in health settings, but that's by the way. I'm actually, at this point, here under false pretenses because Alistair Falk was to be the speaker delivering this presentation. Alistair, unfortunately, has had to give his apologies. So the presentation that I shall give is largely his work. I've sort of added bits, and I've got some other aspects that I just want to touch on during the course of this presentation. What I just want to start out doing is recalling what a couple of years ago was in the mental health task strategy, which of course was an NHS document about children and young people. And it said half of all mental health problems have been established by the age of 14, rising to 75% by the age of 24. So you can see we're talking about a large cohort. And 1 in 10 children aged 5 to 16 has a diagnosable problem such as conduct disorder, anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or depression. One of the other worrying factors is that children from low-income families were found to be at highest risk, 3 times of those from the highest, and those with a conduct disorder were 3 times more likely to become teenage parent, 4 times more likely to be dependent on drugs, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison. And yet, which group get the least support? Children and young people. And that was the case just 2 years ago, and I would say the situation is not dissimilar now. I'm going to start with the good news in quotes, because there is no doubt there is now a much greater awareness in the media and amongst the population about mental health in its widest context. Equally, some might say the DFE is actually looking at things now in a much more supportive and thoughtful way. And in this presentation, Alistair has put together some good examples of good practice and mentions one in a head start. There are additional helpful resources through Time to Change, and the DFE and I've put and health working together potentially. Because if they do, it will be a first, and one that would certainly be worth looking at. However, schools and colleges are a universal service and have a vital role. But I want to touch on that in a moment, because actually young people are falling through the gaps and they are not receiving the services in quite the same way as they enter adulthood. And it's one of the dysfunctionalities, I would say, around children and young people's services. Because the responsibility for provision of services to children and young people goes up to the age of 19, but that's not the case, of course, with mental health through CAMHs. And so you can have a very supportive structure up to the age of 16, and suddenly overnight, because you become an adult in mental health terms, suddenly that support has whole change. And that's one of my criticisms of the Green Paper, because there are no substantive plans to deal with transition from CAMHs to adult mental health services in the Green Paper. And believe it or not, back in March of last year, even the Care Quality Commission highlighted this factor and suggested that local offers, especially those around SEND, should address the ongoing problem of poorly planned, disjointed transitions by setting out how commissioners and providers of children's services and adult services would jointly deliver evidence-based and person-centred transitions. It would be great if that could actually occur, but I worry that we may yet again still have that gap through which lots of children drop. Can I just touch, as Alistair says, is this a watershed moment? And yes, there is indeed an intent in the Green Paper, and I would also encourage you to read the Select Committee's response to the Green Paper and the Government's response to the Select Committee's paper, because there's some interesting critiques going both ways. There is indeed going to be these mental health support teams. However, when you look in detail, you say to yourself, actually, the intent is to have 8,000 staff providing services to approximately 20,000 schools and colleges. However, the rollout they talk about, which they say will happen by 2022-25, will only cover between a quarter and a fifth of that 20,000 schools and colleges. But equally, I have to ask, where are the 8,000 new staff going to come from? Because that's actually a greater number that's currently within the NHS providing mental health services. However, let us hope that the intent in the Green Paper translates into appropriate legislation, and through the NHS 10-year strategy, we do actually see a fundamental shift and a fundamental change in services. The other aspect that I just want to mention from the Green Paper is that mental health is and does sit within a complex landscape. And it does require coordination across a range of services. Not something easy to achieve, but actually is going to be absolutely necessary. So therefore, when you read the Green Paper, actually ask yourself, is there a connect between relevant policies that already exist and here I am going to be incredibly critical of government ministers, especially the first Secretary of State for Education. We have a terribly fragmented education system, and that does not help us to provide a coordinated, integrated service to children and young people that we actually need. However, let's just touch on some of the more good bits, shall we say. And the role of schools is going to be important in this. And of course, the DFE has very recently published non-statutory guidance on mental health and behaviour. And there is a lot of synergy in that non-statutory guidance with the statutory duties that schools have. And if you think about the roles of schools in terms of safeguarding and the roles of governing bodies in safeguarding, you can begin to see that there is a lot of crossover. So in that sense, identifying, assisting, supporting and referring children and young people within schools who have a detectable mental health problem in conjunction with discussion with their parents becomes a natural element within the safeguarding environment. And you will begin to see, certainly in reports, I think, to do with safeguarding that go to governing bodies, an extra element relating to mental health. And that is all to be applauded and supported. And equally, if you look at equality and disability legislation, as there is quite rightly highlighted here, there's no requirement to have a standalone mental health policy. Schools, they choose to, and they may appoint both a member of staff to actually have a lead role in terms of mental health issues, and some schools, even here in Birmingham, have already asked the SEND governor to also take on the additional responsibility related to mental health as schools begin to take on that element to a greater degree. So I think in that sense, it's important to then consider the sensible and thoughtful advice that has been suggested by the DFE. Then we come, don't we, to the question of, is this going to be an additional burden that requires additional resources, or is there going to be an expectation that schools will take on this role, absorb it into what they currently do, and therefore you begin to ask yourself, who's going to take the additional responsibility on top of all the other responsibilities that they already have within schools? Are there going to be an expectation that the teacher takes on the role? Is it going to be a teaching assistant? Is it going to be a higher level teaching assistant, or is it going to be some other member of staff who will take on the role? So in theory and intent, I don't think we can fault what the DFE is trying to suggest to schools. I do worry about how we begin to describe behaviours. Because you can have a school that has a warm, caring, inclusive environment. A school that encourages, adapts, and takes on that ethos that encourages young people to be participants, to look after each other. However, and whilst Alistair has encapsulated what, in my view, would be a great school, I just wonder how many schools are able to do this. Because schools have a necessity to achieve and perform. If you think about the measurement and competitive nature of the school environment at the moment, parents will move house to get too near to a school that is good in the league tables. Schools go out of their way to not necessarily be inclusive and have children within their numbers who need additional support. And we've got a number of issues around parents who are being encouraged by schools to educate at home because their child is not likely to achieve the norms that the school expects to meet the league tables. And therefore they don't want them actually in the school in a way that I think is totally improper. So you've got to ask yourself, is it a sting in the tail? And is it something we've got to take due regard for? And I will leave you with some other questions in regards to this. When the Green Paper was published, government said it would make £300 million of funding available to implement the proposals. However, within this, funding for training leads, 15 to 20 million pounds a year over 5 years, is not additional. It's coming out of existing education budgets. And it will be over and above core funding for schools, but you ask yourself, where within the panoply of services provided through the DFE is that money going to come from? Therefore, what's going to be cut? Funding assumptions are also based on supporting courses of significant duration, similar to a SENCO qualification. And I'm sure many of you here who are SENCOs will know the nature of that requirement, with cover for backfill. These courses are going to be supported under what is known as the Teaching and Learning Innovation Fund. They say to provide sufficient high-quality training that meets these requirements. But you've got to ask yourself, haven't you, how far does 15 to 20 million over 5 years go? How many people can actually be trained with that sum of money? So I'll leave you with those thoughts and then take you through some of the examples that Alistair has referred to. Let's look at some examples of good practice. First of all, the Children's Bureau back in 2017 identified 9 elements of interest, and I think these are highly relevant and should be taken not as individual points but as a collective whole. And also, if you look look at the findings from Supporting Mental Health in Schools and Colleges survey, you can find a number of elements there that shows that there is awareness, there is a desire to assist and support, and there is a desire to refer, to gain the expertise to support those youngsters to continue their educational opportunities. But equally, there needs to be a recognition that mental health and resilience should not be seen necessarily as versus. You shouldn't say to young people with a variety of mental health disorders, you've got to learn to be resilient, you've got to learn to cope with problems. Because many youngsters have neither the skills or the maturity to be able to do that without support. And I come back to the fact that that support is going to be absolutely important. And also, and this is where the Albany Crew have been very successful, that they've been able to look at how to perhaps engage parents in assisting their youngsters through the kind of supportive environment of the Crew. We've got in Birmingham an organisation called the City of Birmingham School, which evolved out of a Crew, and I'm lucky enough to be a member of the management committee, and I've got a colleague here who's the chair of that organisation, and we do spend a lot of time ensuring that youngsters have an environment in which they can first of all feel comfortable, an environment in which they feel supported, an environment in which they can then be encouraged and developed, not only in an educational sense, but in an emotional and personal sense, which is quite transformative when you see what some of them are capable of doing once they've been able to access that kind of support. And many of them come from the most disorganised home backgrounds you could ever imagine. And I think that is the value of the importance of having teaching staff and non-teaching staff in a supportive environment, encouraged to do what is the best job for those individual pupils. There's a good example of Bickleton Primary School, which is in a neighbouring authority just down the road in Walsall, where the head has done a tremendous amount of work. I will have to add that the size of school at a primary level is a determining factor in being able to put in place the structures, the processes and the supportive environment to enable work to be done in this arena. And he certainly has, and this isn't something that's happened recently, this was something that was designed over 3 or 4 years ago, and it is certainly showing results in terms of the young people that go through that school. And also, we should never ever forget to look after the staff themselves. And that's a role that governing bodies should always undertake, because the pressures that are placed on teaching staff, and as an aside, I wonder how many of you could actually survive in a classroom. I know I couldn't, because actually the audience, i.e. the young people in the classroom, are the most critical, they're often the most clever, and doing their utmost to not try to actually engage in the process that they are there to do. When you think about it, as a teacher, you've got to go in that classroom the first thing in the morning, and you've got to perform at the highest possible level throughout that lesson and throughout lessons for the rest of the day. How many of us can actually do that 5 days a week? I know if I'm feeling a bit down, I'll get up from my desk and I'll go for a wander, go and have a coffee. A teacher can't do that. And I don't think we pay due regard to the teaching profession in terms of its capability and that we ask of them. And so it's important that we look after staff. And there are a lot of schools, unfortunately, due to the pressure, don't actually look after the staff properly, impose upon them burdens that I think are above and beyond what is expected of a teacher. The other good thing that is happening in parts of Warsaw is the relationship to a ACAMH service with new one-stop centres. And I think they should be applauded because they've adopted and adapted that in a way that has been incredibly developmental. So, you've got to change the culture, you've got to rethink behaviour, and it's 10 o'clock. That creates a learning culture support. And I think Alistair has encapsulated that incredibly well in that particular slide. And that brings about a school culture. However, let me leave you with a number of questions. First of all, is it a valid relationship between resilience and mental health? Is it behaviour, not behaviours? And do we exercise control in a subtle but a way that understands the concept of consequences for young people? What is the culture of a lot of schools? Is it appropriate, not only for staff, but for young people as well? Do we have enough money, time and resources to do what is necessary to treat and look after each individual child? Not as a collective, but actually look at the needs in each and every young person. And also, and I think Alistair is absolutely right to leave this as a question, are we in danger with the way that media promotes certain high-profile individuals in danger of trivialising actually the real issues and underlying concerns about mental health? And I think the last point I'd like to raise, and it's one about actually the waiting time target, because it should be a 4-week waiting time target. But I wonder just how many young people ever actually receive their referral and follow-up treatment within that 4-week period. It is far from the case, and I think a lot of young people are ill-served. But I hope that sets the scene for today. I hope that leaves you with a number of thoughts in your mind, and I'm very grateful to you for the time to have had the chance to present it on behalf of Alistair and myself. Thank you.
To be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health, visit www.acamh.org.